So, Dan, one of the striking things about your early career is that you were a mime artist in London. So, in your opinion, how important is the art of mime in understanding how to tell a story?
But it's almost the beginning. I mean, it goes back in way back in time, and if you go look at, I hate the word primitive people or to use that, but the uh, quite often it's gesture around a fire at night, acting out the hunt, acting out the fact that the sun went dark, and etc. So it goes way back, and it's completely universal. Uh, we in our modern forms of theater, we still do pure mime, but many forms of theater use mime, and that is a particular example is my work on 2001: A Space Odyssey, where my training as a mime gave me insights into how best to affect the choreography and tell the story.
Yeah, you mentioned 2001: A Space Odyssey there. 1968, you secured the role of Ape Man. What were your first impressions of the movie?
First impressions of what?
Of the movie?
Oh, well, the I didn't see the movie until it was done, and I found it very difficult to watch because I saw all the mistakes I was making and the flaws in my work, which it wasn't until I think about 30 years later that I could actually just watch the movie and not try to fix it all the time, but it's gotten better as the years have gone on. I appreciate it more and more.
Um, Film and television is packed full of pioneering visionaries who helped move a medium on. What sort of man was Kubrick?
Kubrick was a genius. I've had the pleasure of working with a number of geniuses, and one of the defining factors or factors that you see all the time is every genius is unique and different than every other one. They're different than us. They they're just not like us. They have their own vision, their own world they live in, and they see things in their own way. Uh, Stanley Kubrick, on the surface, was this sort of nerdy sense of humor guy from the Queens in New York with that sort of accent, which belied his incredible intelligence. The thing you discovered about Stanley at first, oh, what a just a regular guy, and he's friendly and whatnot, seems to know absolutely everything about everything, is that he was always 3 or 4 moves ahead of everybody around him. He could always, it's almost as if you get the feeling he could see the future because he was a chess player, and he used to hustle chess to get enough money to see movies. And he had that, well, if this happens, this is going to happen, that will happen, this will probably happen. Now, if that doesn't happen, another probability is this, which is about 30% of the other ones, and now there's the 70%. So I'm going to bet on the 70% for the time being, but I'm going to keep the 30. He's thinking like that all the time, and the rest of us are just reacting to what's going on around us.
Mm. Josh asked, do you think he was one of the last true great directors?
No, I think he came out of a great period in Hollywood. But I think that the beauty of all art forms is that they may go into a lapse time or a downtime where you may not have as many things, and then all of a sudden a new one arises that you never thought you'd see. And that's that's the beauty of all art forms is that you think you've seen the greatest, and then maybe, well, the English language, we certainly haven't topped Shakespeare, but Stanley was as probably the best living director when he was alive, and he may be the greatest director of all time.
Yeah. So, moving on to another genius, do you remember the first time you met John Lennon and what were your first impressions of him?
Well, I saw John Lennon a couple times before I met him at parties. I was the first time I saw John was at a birthday party for Allen Ginsberg about 1965 in London. It was a big, big party in a big house. A rich lady, I think it was Panagrady or somebody like that, has thrown this party. And Allen was completely naked, standing in a corner. And we were talking to him because I knew him and I had published some of his poetry and I had done readings with him. And I heard this voice behind me. It's Allen Ginsberg and he's fucking naked, and the Beatles were standing behind me. They had crashed the party. And that was the first time. The second time when I actually met John, was introduced to him, was when Yoko first got together with him. And Yoko and I had apartments side by side. And she wanted to bring over her new boyfriend to meet us. And so there's a knock on the door, and John and Yoko are standing there, and I'm thinking, this is a fucking Beatle, this guy is, like that, wow. And he's going like, Yoko said, John's very nervous because because of what you did in 2000, because you're working with Stanley Kubrick. And so he was sort of shy because he thought himself just a rock and roller, not an artist, which I always told him, you're one of the great artists of the 20th century, don't give me that. And so they came in and we met, and it was really nice because my friendship with John was not because of rock and roll, not because I was a rock and roll. I did nothing against rock and roll. I listened to all kinds of music. Rock and roll wasn't, I wasn't into it like that. And the so I was one of the few people around John who wasn't from the rock and roll world or the rock and roll universe or the rock and roll fans or the people who were impressed because he was a Beatle. I was this friend of Yoko's who was in the art world and appreciated what he did, and but I never bullshitted him. I always told him what I thought. He'd ask me, "What do you think of this, Dan?" And I say, "I think this is ridiculous." And anybody else would say, "It's wonderful, John, and you're wonderful, and will you give me some money?"
Yeah. Nowadays, it's easy for entertainers to flow into different parts of the industry, but 50 years ago, it was unheard of. In your opinion, how pivotal was Lennon to forging this path for others to follow?
That's a good question. I think John was very important in that way. I think people couldn't think of him as not doing what Beatles do and making the sort of Beatle music. And once he met Yoko and she pretty much set him free and showed him he was free to do all kinds of things. So he led the way. And I think many rock and roll artists after him realized that they didn't have to just be a rock and roller. They could be in films, they could do all kinds of things. Well, Elvis did that too. Elvis was in films before the Beatles were.
How determined was he to shake off that Beatle image?
He was very determined. He felt it had become a burden, and it was restricting him because if he did anything that wasn't Beatles, the press would come down on him and saying John Lennon is, doing what is he doing? We want the real John and what. So he was under terrible pressure, and he was wrestling with it for really a year or two before he met Yoko, perhaps earlier. And Yoko said, "You're free. You can do anything you want. Just forget about what they're saying. You know, you're an artist." And she gave him the permission to step away from the Beatles and create a new creative life for himself.
Mm. So Josh's next question was how influential was Yoko in establishing John as an artist?
Well, Yoko is very influential. John John was very eager to learn. First of all, he'd gone to art school, you know, and he'd written books like The Spaniard in the Works, whatnot, with wonderful. He had a wonderful line drawings style. He did, so he really was an artist. You know, he just didn't know it almost. You know, he just thought this. The Beatles, you can't. Today, it's hard to explain how big the Beatles thing was. I mean, it was
Mm.
gigantic, you know, and the pressures that came from all over the world. Every word he said was looked at carefully and compared to other words that the Beatles had said. So, and Yoko said, let's get in a bag and just fuck the world, you know, just do whatever we want. You're free. You're free. And she gave him that. And so we end up getting Imagine and all of this wonderful work that was a result of that wouldn't have happened had John not met Yoko. You know, those are her words. She gave John once said to me, Yoko said to me, when I sing, I want to hold your hand, millions of people hear those words. Why don't you say words that are more important? And and it was like a lightning bolt to him, you know. And I mean, Imagine is a perfect example of those are Yoko's words, those are Yoko's ideas, and she gave him that. You know, she was like his guide into the art world, into his guide to his own artistic uh, being. You know, and the gift she gave him is immeasurable, and particularly what it's given to the world.
What did they like about America?
Well, there's more television stations. You know, I mean, that time in England, and you have to remember, John can't just go around all the time because you know, he's just invaded
Yeah.
constantly by people. So he watched a lot of television. He would watch television while he was composing songs. And I always thought of it, it was his window into the real world, where, you know, because he stepped into the real world, he would influence it, he would change it just by his presence being there. But he could watch television. So I may sound a little flippant, but he could see there was so much more television. Also, New York was the center of the world at that point, and John was one of the most important humans in the world, and he wanted to be where the action was. There was also the fact of Yoko's daughter Kyoko, who her ex-husband Tony Cox had run off with, and they knew she was in the States someplace, and they did not want to leave. Nixon was also trying to not let him in, and so they were very afraid after they went there after Imagine that if they left they couldn't get back in. I had to sneak him in once. I We had a custody hearing for Kyoko in St. Thomas, and they weren't giving John. They would told him he couldn't come in. You know, so we flew to Antigua, and I rented a little plane, gave the guy round trip money in case they wouldn't let us in, and I called the radio stations and said John Lennon's about to land at Charlotte Amalie Airport. Get everybody. He wants to see everybody, and so there was an immense crowd when he landed. And we were able to get a 24-hour emergency visa, which got him in, you know, and then we went up to New York, you know.
Josh, did you have to do that sort of thing a lot when he went anywhere to? sort of protects him, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. I thought I was going to take a bullet once. We were John Yoko and I were staying at the Plaza Hotel in New York, and John had been talking to Bob Dylan, and we were going to meet Bob Dylan at the Plaza. So I had the I had the limo come up to the side entrance on Central Park South, and I got out. I went inside. I looked around. Everything looked clear. I didn't see any weird people, you know. And so I went back to the limo. I said, "Okay, guys, let's go." And we start walking in, and suddenly this guy who looks like Jack Ruby in a suit and whatnot comes comes at us like this, putting his hand inside his coat. So I jump in front and say, "Talk to me. Who are you?" You know, and the guy pulls the hand out and he's got a badge, not a gun. And he says, "I'm security and I'm here to help Mr. And Mrs. Lennon." I
Mm.
said, "Thank you very much, but you scared the shit out of us, you know. So we walked over to the elevator, and there's Bob in sort of camouflage unit, just completely. You would never know it was Bob Dylan, and he's laughing, and we all got in the elevator and went upstairs. So that was a typical thing.
Yeah. You mentioned about New York being sort of the center of the world. Well, at that time, especially, what do you think it is about the US that makes it appealing for international artists to want to be based there?
It is the center of the world, and if you an international artist by definition is a very rich man, you know, and just like a big rock and roll star by definition is a very rich man or rich lady, whatever. And the States is, if it's like you're going to sell more. The value of your work is going to be higher. You're going to get more accolades. You're going to get much more sophisticated press. It's just a comfortable place to be if you're that famous and rich.
Hmm. Obviously, the 8th of December 1980 is a dark day in the history of pop culture. What do you remember about the day?
Hmm. I remember my heart was broken, but I was my my son Will had just been born, and I was in the Chelsea Hotel, and I was making a painting, to celebrate his birth. And I was listening to the radio, to music on the radio, and this voice came on and said that John had been shot. And it was like it's like I'd been kicked by a mule. And I picked up the phone to call Yoko, and her phone is off the hook. She just, yeah, like that. So I sent her a telegram saying that anything she needed, I would do, just if, whatnot, and that my heart was with her, and my heart was broken. And that's what I remember. That's the way it was for me.
Hmm. Oh, Justin, how significant was that moment in the history of pop culture?
Oh, it was terribly significant. I just from a it's sort of sad to say, but it pushed John from into almost sainthood. You pay a tremendous price for that, and he paid the price. And it also helped us and helped the world appreciate the values that he and Yoko stood for. And I think that's very important. The during the Arab Spring and like some riot in Syria, the crowd is singing "Imagine." It's New Year's Eve in New York City when the ball goes down. They they sing Imagine, it goes out all around the world. Um, and it just reinforced and increased that almost his saintly status.
Mm. Josh, this question, in doing the podcast for over 8 years, we've spoken to so many people about missed icons whose relevance increases over the years as it goes by. Why do you think we have such a fascination with preserving the legacy of departed cultural icons?
I think it's a very primal feeling that we have. I think that so we go back to our so-called, and again, I don't like the word primitive peoples, that's how you remember people who are important to you. You venerate them. And also the difference between being remembered and being forgotten is so fragile. And it's almost mysterious how certain people like John just take on this magical presence. I mean, sometimes I'm amazed by it because I think this guy I know, my friend who I'd laughed and had fun with, and he was just a guy, but he
Yeah.
wasn't, he wasn't. He was so much more, and I'm so privileged to have had him as a friend and to spend really almost 4 years, witnessing some of his greatest creations and just having fun with him.
Hmm. What's Yoko doing now? Why do you think she stepped away from the spotlight in recent years?
Yoko is very frail. Um, she's okay, but she's a couple of years ago. I last saw her about 4 or 5 years ago when they did an evening of her music at the L.A. Philharmonic here, and I went backstage after, and Elliot, her press person, arranged for her and I to have some time together, before all the adulation and the people came in. And I remember holding her hands and saying, because at that evening there was standing ovations and, like this, and she was in a wheelchair, and holding her hands, and we both started crying. I said, look, because when I first met her, everybody was giving her a tough time and whatnot, and she was struggling. And I'd been through the years with John. Yoko was under constant attack, and we both just were crying. We were both just crying about what had happened. But I'm in touch with family members and whatnot, and she's getting quite frail. And they went up to the estate in Franklin during COVID, and it just became clear that she was a little too frail to come back. And my wife Jill was going up to see her last summer with Kyoko, but couldn't get down to New York in time to meet up with Kyoko, so she missed the visit. But I hear from a lot of people, and it's amazing she's lasted so long. She's given us so much.
Hmm. Yeah. What's John Lennon's legacy?
John Lennon's legacy is John Lennon. Is that he was he he wrote some of the most amazing music since Mozart. I mean, he and Paul probably wrote more tunes, actually successful tunes and songs. Nobody since Mozart has been that prolific musically. So you have that, but you also have the ideas embodied in Yoko's work. By John picking them up, he gave them to the world and he shared them with the world. And these are big ideas. We're talking about peace, which we're not even close to it yet. I don't know if we'll ever get there. But the ideas, he's given us these ideas to mull over, to think about, to believe in. And And also, he's just a magical person, you know. He's just who makes who God doesn't usually make people like that, you know.
Hmm.
Hotel, no, if no, wrong, one, someone, one, who, and he has from him, who, table, sorry, home, and I want what he think about that wrong level not girl home
Josh said we interviewed Jimmy Tarbuck, who went to school with John Lennon, and he said when they were at school, he was a very shy child. And Josh said he wondered what you think about the sort of rise from a shy working class child into a global megastar and the sort of effects that has on someone.
Well, John was always shy. He doesn't. I don't think people think of him as shy, but if you know him, he was shy. I think he was shy all his life. He got very nervous before a performance. He just was. He'd quite often vomit before going on stage. Uh, he was he was constantly saying, "Did we get this right? Have we done this? Shall we do it this way? Should we like So if you knew him, he was this wonderful sense of humor, fairly shy, but he had a strange he, for a shy person, he was also fearless. He was prepared to go all the way, you know. It might be hard for him to do that, but he was going to do it. And so it's a strange combination, but I I thought of him as shy.
Mm. So, looking back at your own career, what's your proudest achievement?
I think the choreography I did and playing Moonwatcher in 2001, working with Stanley Kubrick, certainly. I'm very I'm quite proud of some of my performances early in my career. I'm certainly very proud of the contributions, the artistic contributions I gave to John and Yoko's work. I did the Plastic Ono Band covers and designed those albums. I pretty much produced almost all of their experimental films and some of the non-experimental ones. And I also, I guess it was a very creative time for me working with John and Yoko, even though I was in the shadow of these two sort of gigantic creatures. I'm very proud of the work I did there.
Mm. And our last question, what's next for you, Dan?
Probably death. I'm 85. I,
That's a glass half full.
no, I've got I've got Parkinson's disease. 3 years ago, I was skiing black diamonds and rock climbing. Right now I've got Parkinson's disease. So there's that, and I've got some form of T-cell lymphoma, which they say probably won't kill me, but might. I'm looking forward to a round of chemo in a few weeks, and so, I've had a wonderful life. And what's next is I'm going to live each day as though it's my last. I'm going to love my children. I adore my new granddaughter. I have wonderful friends. And still, even though I've tried to retire from almost everything, like this morning, there was at least 3 emails asking me to help with them with this or change, can I change this or can I introduce them to the curator of this collection at UCLA or whatnot. So I'm still very active. I don't think I was working on a third book, but about the Chelsea, but I stopped writing it because there was so many drugs in it. And the problem is when you write about drugs, even if you're writing to say as a cautionary tale, a lot of young people see it as glorifying the drugs and romanticizing it. And I decide I don't need to burden the world with another book that talks about drugs, you know.
Mm.
How, how, how do you whatever would be remembered for the people who just yeah.
Josh, then how do you think that era will be remembered from the Beatles to John and Yoko?
Oh, it'll be remembered. It will be remembered. It'll be one of the great creative and cultural shifts historically, and it will be remembered. And the world before and the world after, you couldn't even imagine that amount of change happening, and the everything changed, even language, you know. I mean, language is changing all the time, but the amount of it, the sheer women in the 50s, a woman in the United States couldn't get a credit card unless her husband co-signed for it, you know.
Mm.
Who could we
Josh said that's a perfect way to end. Thank you very much for thanks for coming on and thanks for your
yeah,
amazing stories.
yeah,
Well, it's been my pleasure, and it's a pleasure meeting both of you.
Oh,
And keep up the good work. Keep telling the story, you know.
thank you. Really
Yeah.
appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day and
All right, you take
take
care.
care. Yeah, take care of yourself. Bye now.
Bye bye.
Bye.
yeah.